On my hand here is actually one of the latest lens by Laowa. This is the Argus 33mm F0.95 lens, and it is a portrait lens. So before I start this video, because this is such a specialty lens itself, let's take a look at some photos shot by this lens, and then after, if you are still interested, take a look at this full review behind. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions, and this is the Laowa 33mm F0.95 Argus lens. So this is of course a brand new lens for the purpose of X mount and portrait usage. This is the X-S10, Fujifilm X-S10, one of the newer cameras, very small, very light, and together with the Argus 33mm here, it is a really nice combination. Laowa really made a very nice lens in terms of its sizing and overall fit on this camera itself. By the time you watch this video, I probably returned the lens already, because this lens loaned to me is a pre-production set. So there are certain things that may be tuned, especially I think in terms of build quality, because there are still some things that, if you ask me, a little bit loose. But overall, this lens is pretty much very, very nice to utilize. And I would say, if you are looking for a portrait lens and don't mind doing it in manual focus, this is probably the lens for you. Now, before I start, I would say that Laowa loaned me this lens. So this is a lens loaned by Laowa. They actually contacted me and loaned me this copy here. I'm going to return it really, really soon. By the time you watch this video, it's definitely out of my hand already. And I really enjoyed using it. So I did about 4 to 5 photo shoots with it. You would have seen the photos earlier. So I probably did like 5 photo shoots by then, when this review is published. And I would say, I truly enjoy using this lens. 33mm f0.95 will equate to about 50mm f1.2 or f1.4, depending on how you want to see it. So on the APS-C, this is probably one of the lenses that give you a quality that you could not get on APS-C itself. Now, Fujifilm initially wanted to make a 33mm f1, but they were saying that it's too big, it's too hard, and it didn't happen, so it became a XF50mm f1. But Laowa actually managed to make it, and this is the 33mm f0.95, and it is a really, really nice lens. So let's go through this lens as part of the review, and as I say, this is loaned to me, and let's take a look at what this lens has to offer, from a lens review point of view. Firstly, this lens is a full metal lens. It is a manual lens, and as you can see here, it has a aperture ring and of course a focusing ring. I'm turning it using the body itself. Now, this is a pre-production lens, so I think some of the mechanical things are not that tight, not absolutely tight, so there is some play in the lens. Other than that, it's still okay. Now, the aperture ring is not clicked, so normally this is associated with a video lens itself. So this is something I noticed, and I hope that actually they add a click to it, because for the purpose of photography, especially portraiture, you want it to click so that firstly it holds itself properly, and secondly, when you are actually shifting it down, you can probably not look at this ring and shift the aperture up and down easier. The thing is, without a click aperture, it becomes very simple to just knock it and go out of 0.95, or you do not know what you're turning. At least I won't know. Now, of course, this is great for video purpose. You have a very smooth aperture ring itself, but this is a bit too close to the back, and if you are using an X-S10, there's probably no room for you to even put a focusing gear, or just nice, I think barely enough to put a focusing gear there. So that's something to note. Now, it goes from 0.95 all the way to f16, so there is quite a big range here. And the aperture ring is very, very smooth, so there's nothing much to talk about, and very nice to grip also. Now, the next thing is, of course, the focus ring. For a manual focus lens, this is probably the most important part of things. And the manual focusing ring, if you can see here, I'm not sure, maybe I'll have a close-up. This is infinity, and this is 0.35 meters. Now, this is, of course, a hard infinity ring, so when you put it all the way in infinity, I did notice that it is about at infinity, but you can do a little bit of fine-tuning to obtain a little bit more sharpness, just a little bit more sharpness. But other than that, infinity for infinity subjects are usually truly infinity. As long as it's not using 0.95, if you're using anything more than 0.95, it's truly infinity itself. The lens itself, one thing to note that it has an extremely big focusing turn, you know. It goes from infinity to 0.35. If you notice here, it's so close together, it is about 300 degrees. So as a video lens, it's great, but as a photo lens, it is a lot of turning in the field. So, you know, best is that you can pre-focus, so you know that your subject is going to stand about a meter away, turn to 1 meter, and then do the fine focusing there. It's a lot faster, a lot quicker. If not, you have to turn, and you don't know what you're doing in the EVF itself. Now, the focusing ring is really smooth, very nice. Not the smoothest in the world, I would say, as this is on par with most Zeiss lens, except for their highest Otus lens, but definitely not on the same quality as maybe, like, say, the Leica lenses. The Leica lenses are like oil smooth. This is just a little bit, I would say it's very smooth, but still a little bit rough. Maybe a bit of oiling in the final set will have made this lens a lot better. As I said, this is a pre-production set. The final set may be a lot smoother, you know, for whatever reasons. Other than that, very nice ring to turn and very huge focusing ring. So you can actually get very, very precise manual focus with this ring itself. So you don't need to worry about getting your thing perfectly sharp, because this focusing ring here is big enough for that. Now, the lens comes with a hood that you can just twist out. It's a very, very small hood. So now this hood is really, really shallow. If you ask me, if anything, is meant to protect the front element rather than to truly, you know, act as a hood. So you probably want to buy some sort of other hood to actually just make sure that light don't hit into the lens itself. Now, usually hood is meant for flaring. I did notice that this lens is quite resistant to flare. I don't notice any flare when I shot with the sky behind or when there's a light that's coming from an angle. So I don't think that it is that susceptible to flare. So maybe the hood is not that important. Now that is of course it for the build quality itself. A really nice and well-built lens, really, all metal. I hope that the final version has just a little bit more tighter, more tolerant. I would say it's less tolerance in everything, because there is still a little bit of play in the lens here. Now, in case you want to know what is the size of this lens in comparison with other X-mount lenses, you can see that this is the XF 16mm F1.4. So this lens is very, very similar in sizing. So it is not a very big lens, and neither is it a very small lens, I would say, but definitely very usable as a 33mm F0.95. Just note, this is an autofocus lens, so there is of course all this autofocus mechanism which takes up a few mm of space in the entire radius and diameter, while this is a pure manual focus lens, so they can build it more tightly and more compact, if you ask me. But still, 33mm F0.95. Remember what Fuji said? If they were to make a 33mm F0.95, it would have been massive. While this is actually really small and compact. Of course, autofocus lens, as they get bigger aperture, they tend to be a lot larger. Just look at a Leica or Otus versus one of the autofocus lenses by Canon, by Fujifilm GFX, and you'll know the difference really. Autofocus does add quite a bit of sizing, just to know if you want it to be fast, precise, and good. Now, beyond, of course, the build quality, I usually talk about handling, but because this is a manual focus lens, there is really nothing much to say about. I mean, out in the field, it is nice, it is small, and on the X-S10 with a very good grip, you can really handhold it with one hand. But because this is a manual focus lens, you really need two hands either way to just turn the focus itself, so there is nothing much to talk about. And the focus ring, as I said, is a little bit tight. So you will need a bit of effort to turn it, and it's because it's so long, right? It's best to pre-focus. If you don't pre-focus, when you are using it, you may not get to where you want in any good time, and your model probably wait a little bit longer than normal. So just do a bit of pre-focus and then take the shot there. And that's already about it for handling. I have nothing much to talk about handling, because this is a manual focus lens. It is small, it is light, it is compact, and there is no autofocus mechanism, nor is there any auto aperture, anything. So out in the field, this is probably as good as it gets for the purpose of handling itself. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is image quality. Now, in terms of image quality, I'll say this lens as a 33mm F0.95, if you ask me, is my minimum standard of usable wide open. And if you have seen my channel, I use a lot of high-end equipment. I mean, the R5 with the RF lenses, or the GFX with all its awesome lens itself, and I reviewed quite a lot of lens out there. So as a minimum standard, this lens kind of passed it. In fact, if you ask me, this lens is truly the minimum standard. And I feel that the XF50mm is truly a niche product because it is slightly lower than my standards. But this lens is truly my minimum standard of what it means to be a good lens wide open. This lens itself is not like super sharp wide open. I would say it's definitely sharper than the XF50mm from my memory. I mean, the XF50mm has this really weird glow, while this lens doesn't have it. And the XF50mm suffers a little bit more from chromatic aberrations, while this lens here, the Argus 33mm here, suffer less chromatic aberrations, and overall, if you ask me, a lot more usable out there. Now, just to show you some real world photos I shot with my models Cheryl, Kathy, and you can see that there is really little chromatic aberrations in really strong sunlight. I mean, these areas are the areas where a 0.95 lens probably will bloom and glow and have tons of chromatic aberration that make them really unusable. But this lens is really quite usable as 0.95 itself. Let me show you some static shots here. I mean, the static shots will show you some of the, questions and answers that probably you have for image quality. The static shot wise, in terms of shooting at infinity for this landscape itself, you notice that overall the shot is quite usable. Everything is not like super soft nor super sharp, but it is very usable throughout the entire frame at 0.95. Now the corners are not that super great. Extreme corners have a little bit of smearing, but if not, the purpose of a portrait lens, which is the center and maybe the more outer regions that forms the 1/3 frame, this lens definitely can do it and will do it well. So that is it in terms of general sharpness. In terms of chromatic aberration, is really well controlled. Now there is of course chromatic aberrations. I can see here a bit of green tinge depending on how you want to shoot it. I mean, if you shoot with very strong backlight, there is some chromatic aberrations. But is this chromatic aberrations bad? No, definitely lower than even the X-S10 significantly. So overall, a very usable lens. In fact, it's one of the lower chromatic aberration lens for a fast prime. I believe if I'm not wrong in my memory itself, even I think the RF 85mm F2 is about the same as this, so there's something to note. So overall, in terms of chromatic aberration control, it is very good. Now, of course, so far we have talked about 0.95. Let's take a look at a bit of the 1.4 and F2 photos. How do I know it's 1.4 or F2? Firstly, the metadata doesn't write it, but I see the shutter speed is either half or if not a quarter speed of what 0.95 offers, right? So in terms of f1.4 and f2, you can see some of the shots here. Now this is of course Cheryl. I did a portrait shoot with her. Just focus on the eyelashes. At 1.4 it is sharp. I mean, it's not like super tech sharp. Not 85mm RF sharp, nor is it GF 110mm sharp, but it is sharp. Very usable as a 50mm equivalent lens. At f2 it is tech sharp. Truly tech sharp if you ask me. Very sharp, very high contrast, and very usable at f2. But most importantly, at f0.95. Now, why do you want to buy such a lens? Normally, it's because its purpose is for portraiture and for the bokeh. And f0.95, the bokeh is smooth, really smooth. Take a look at some of the shots here. Super smooth bokeh, super nice bokeh. And because the chromatic aberration is not really high, especially for its longitudinal CA, which affects your which affects your bokeh itself, there is very little of it, or if you ask me, quite minimal unless in very strong highlights. The overall bokeh coming out of this lens is one of the smoothest bokeh you can get, especially considering that it is an APS-C. I mean, the only lens that probably can beat it in bokeh today is probably the 200mm f2, which is a monster of a lens if you ask me. So definitely, I enjoyed using this lens a lot. It is a really nice portrait lens, very smooth, very nice bokeh, 0.95, giving you this very shallow depth of field, which is a bit magical for APS-C itself. Now, one of the reasons why portrait lenses such as these are very novelty in terms of usage is because they are not designed to be ultra sharp. Because for the purpose of portraiture, we don't really need ultra sharp lenses. A lot of people were commenting on one of my previous posts. They'll say that, yes, it's a novelty lens, they will get it, especially for the X-S10. Because really, for the purpose of portraiture, you don't really need ultra sharp lenses, and I will actually agree with that. But however, I would say, even though yes, I don't need ultra sharp lenses, I need lenses with very low chromatic aberrations, because the color fringing literally kills me, both in the latitude and the longitude. Latitude, which means in focal plane; longitude, which means behind in the bokeh. Really. This lens is truly the lens for me. If this lens was autofocus, I would have bought it in a heartbeat without thinking, because it gives me that effect I want. Slightly soft look that is very usable, yet very controlled in chromatic aberration, very smooth bokeh. And the fact is that it is on the APS-C body, not a full frame, and you can achieve the same effect as what a full frame lens with probably a Nikon 58mm f1.4, I believe, or f1.2, that lens has the same rendering as this, and probably that is what you need to really get the same look and feel of this lens here, which is a much more heavy and much more expensive lens itself. Now, overall, if you ask me, if you are looking for a portrait lens for the X mount system and do not mind manual focusing, this is really the lens for you. I mean, I have used so much of the XF lenses. If you really want that smooth, beautiful bokeh, that nice little glow on the human skin, especially for female portraiture, this is definitely the lens. And once you stop down, it is an extremely sharp lens that probably won't lose out to any of Fujifilm's f2 lenses or f1.4 lenses. So overall, it is a very versatile lens, considering that Fujifilm, most lenses are f1.4, and this guy at 1.4 will be as good as them, if not slightly better than them, because its chromatic aberration control is truly better than most XF lens I have seen. Definitely better than the f2 lenses. At f2, these lenses have almost no chromatic aberrations, and that will literally beat most of the f2 lenses in Fujifilm range. Now, in terms of pricing wise, I'm not really sure. It was not released to me, but I think it's probably less than 1,000 Sing dollars. Probably, I'm not too sure. So, I do not know, I'm just doing a guess here, or maybe even slightly more than 1,000 Sing dollars. But even then, considering that it's a 33mm F0.95, this lens is still a steal, considering the image quality and what you can achieve with this lens that probably requires you a full frame and more novelty lenses there to achieve similar effect. Really a nice buy if you do not mind manual focusing. And that's about it for today's review. I hope you enjoyed this. This is the 33mm Argus lens by Laowa, 33mm F0.95, which is one of the more novelty lenses you can ever get, and Laowa makes tons of novelty lenses, right? So definitely, if you are looking for portraiture, this is the lens for you. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.